Wood home, Togo's slave house of horrors that was run by an African royalty in the 19th century. The triangular trade of African captives took place between the 16th and of the 19th century. During that period, European powers of the time, namely the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish, made it lawful for their citizens to travel to Africa, buy black Africans and ship them to the Americas to work as enslaved labor in plantations, construction sites, etc. Slave ports in Togo included Agbodrafo, formerly called Porto Seguro or Safe Harbor by the Portuguese traders, and Aneho, formerly known as Little Popo. In this video, we will focus on Agbodrafo, a small town at about 35 kilometers east of Lomé, and 13 kilometers west of Aneho, on the Togolese part of the coastal road, Abidjan Lagos, the N2. We are visiting this town because of its past links with the triangular trade and its two historical vestiges: the House of Slaves and Gatovoudo, which means in local language, the Well of the Chained. These remnants of the past continue to attract many visitors to Agbodrafo, making the town one of the most popular tourist destinations, still arousing curiosity and emotions from visitors. In modern Togo, nearby Aneho, 13 kilometers east of Agbodrafo, was founded in the late 17th century by Ani people fleeing from Ashanti attacks in Elmina, now in Ghana. It later developed as a slave port and commercial center. Both Little Popo and Porto Seguro had slave markets. Slaves from Ashanti, Benin and other parts of the region were transited there to be displayed, sold, and shipped to the land of no return as part of the triangular trade. But what is the triangular trade? To understand the triangular trade and the House of Slaves in Agbodrafo, we need to go back in time. It all started in 1452, after the discovery of the New World, the Americas, by Christopher Columbus. The Portuguese and Spanish settlers began establishing new colonies there, around year 1500. They initially forced the local Indians to work their plantations. The violence of conquest, however, combined with the impact of European diseases, devastated them. The result was a labor shortage that caused the Europeans to look to Africa for a solution. This marked the beginning of the triangular slave trade that lasted nearly 400 years, and generally following a triangular route. Traders set sail from European ports, with ships loaded with goods such as arms, textiles, and wine, to the coast of West Africa. There, they bought black Africans in exchange for the goods, and packed them below ship deck. They then embarked on a 6 to 8 weeks voyage across the Atlantic to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage. Once in the Americas, those African captives, who had survived the journey, were offloaded for sale, and put to work as enslaved labor, mainly in plantations, or to build new towns, churches, houses, to be home servants, etc. The ships then returned to Europe, with goods such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and later cotton produced by enslaved labor, and sell them for profits. The triangle, involving 3 continents, was complete. European cities, African labor and American land and resources combined to supply a European market. The colonists in the Americas also made direct slaving voyages to Africa, which did not follow the triangular route. This trade increased after 1800, particularly from Brazil. In the Spanish West Indies and in Portuguese Brazil, enslaved Indians were gradually replaced by Africans. As the English, French, and Dutch colonized the smaller West Indian islands in the 17th century, they also created plantations. At first, the bulk of manual labor was done by poor whites, some of whom were indentured servants, but black slavery eventually surpassed white servitude in these colonies. The Dutch became the foremost slave traders during parts of the 17th century. In the following century, English and French merchants controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade. Many of the enslaved people were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. A section of the African coast in what are now the countries of Togo, Benin, and Nigeria became known as the Slave Coast. Many more enslaved people were taken from West Central Africa, centered on the Portuguese colony in what is now Angola. A smaller number came from Portuguese-controlled parts of southeastern Africa. The triangular trip took from few weeks to several months. The captives were packed tightly into tiers below decks, and were typically chained together. The almost continuous dangers faced by the captives included epidemic diseases, attack by pirates, and physical, sexual, and psychological abuse at the hands of their captors. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database estimate, between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died aboard slave ships. 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World, from which 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage. The effect of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa was devastating. The loss of so many people, the frequent slave raids and violence, weakened many societies there and made colonization of Africa so much easier afterwards. Indeed, the colonization of sub-Saharan Africa began around 1880, shortly after the abolition of slave trade. Slave trade of Africans was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, by France in 1848, by the USA in 1865, Brazil in 1888. The fact that there was no single date agreed by all European powers of the time explains the persistence of illegal slave trading despite its abolition and the existence of the House of Slaves in Agbodrafo. While some colonies and the European powers were no longer accepting slaves from Africa, other places, like the USA or Brazil, were still taking them, legally or illegally. Back to slave trade along the coast of Togo, namely Aneho and Abbodrafo, history tells us that the Portuguese were the first to get into contact with Aneho's inhabitants and start the slave trading business. This expanded with the invasion of the English by the 17th century. Slave traders instigated wars between Aneho's people and their neighbors and took advantage of the battles to capture people into slavery. Residents were obviously violently opposed to the slave trade and frequently engaged in uprisings to drive off Western slave traders. Sadly, several local powerful men supported the business, aiding the merchants to capture and sell people into slavery. Slave trade continued until 28 August 1833, when a very important law in the UK received its royal assent. The Slavery Abolition Law would finally be enacted by the British Parliament. The Slavery Abolition Act 1833 provided for the immediate abolishment of slavery in most parts of the British Empire. This Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom expanded the jurisdiction of the Slave Trade Act 1807, and made the purchase or ownership of slaves illegal within the British Empire. Unfortunately, the abolition of slave trade did not sit well with several West African chiefs, including Aneho's chief, Asiakoli. Accustomed to the practices of slave trading on the shores of Aneho, Chief Asiakoli and its notables could indeed not abandon this lucrative trade, despite the injunctions of the Western powers and the surveillance of anti-slavery cruisers in the Gulf of Benin. After internal tribal conflict within his Ajigo clan, Chief Asiakoli and some of his loyalists were expelled from Aneho and relocated to Agbodrafo, where they continued their illegal trade. Then, in 1835, an English merchant named John Henry Wood set foot in his village with the same motives to continue illegal slave trade. Chief Asiakoli welcomed him, and both came to a deal. The deal was for Wood to build a house in a secret location for himself, Chief Asiakoli and his family. In building the house and living in together, Wood and the chief would work together to capture slaves, sell them, and split the profit. The house was known as Wood Home, or the House of Slaves, as it is called today. This house was intended to operate illegally as a slave trading post, despite the abolition of slavery. Less than a year after they met, the house was built. Wood Home was at the time located in an area masked by vegetation, 3 kilometers away from the Atlantic coast. The house is of Afro-Brazilian style, inspired by idiosyncratic neo-Baroque architecture, which was in vogue throughout Europe in the 19th and 20th century. In the colonies of the Americas, European settlers applied some elements of this neo-Baroque designs in their constructions of churches and houses using their enslaved labor. It is therefore probable that slave trader John Wood had the necessary construction and design know-how to be able to incorporate elements of Baroque architecture in his Agbodrafo's home, with the feel of grand entrance at the front of the house, arches on the doors and windows with wooden shutters. As this house was built by an Englishman, it is normal to expect some elements of British design in the construction. And indeed, the house does not disappoint with the presence of vents and cellars in the foundation of the building and the hatched access door. In Britain and many Western countries, many old and new homes are built the same way, that is, with vented cellars under the house. In parallel, for many constructions in other places, including Togo, the walls of the house are built on slab foundation, that's fully cemented or concreted foundation. Here, wood home construction incorporates this very old method of building the structure, which includes the addition of an empty space in the foundation of the house. The house is built with a foundation of up to 1.5 meters in height. Then, the ground floor is built above the foundation void using solid floorboards, laid on joists and load-bearing beams, built into the foundation walls and sitting on brick piers for stability. The void space within the foundation now becomes a cellar, a usable space called crawl space. In other words, the crawl space is this space within the foundation, which is left unoccupied, unfinished, this narrow space between the grounds and ground floor. The crawl space is so named because there is typically enough room to crawl rather than stand. Anything larger than 1 to 1.5 meters or 3 feet, 3 inches to 4 feet, 11 inches, would tend to be considered a basement. Wood home meets the exact spec of British construction design. See the similarity. This meant, should the anti-slavery cruisers ever come ashore to inspect this house, they would have struggled to find anything abnormal about the house. Crawl spaces are normally used as storage space, access to repair plumbing, electrical wiring, heating, and cooling systems without the need for excavation. Vents are usually made in the crawl space walls to allow air to circulate, ground gases and humidity to escape, instead of inside the house above. Few houses with crawl spaces do have an access. This can either be somewhere along the walls of the foundation, or a hatched door on the ground floor of the house. That of the House of Slaves was hatched on the ground floor of the living room. And again here, see the similarity. The house measures 21.6 meters long, and 9.95 meters wide, and consisting of 6 rooms, a large living room, 1.5 meters wide corridors, 1.5 meters high crawl spaces under the entire building. Local and imported materials such as cement, fired bricks, palmwood slats, galvanized sheets, and sea sand were used to build the villa. This shows, a lot of attention was actually put into building this house as it was meant to be fit for a chief to live in. Now, where wood home shows its true colors are in the alteration of the vents, crawl spaces and change of use of the property. First, the vents of the building foundation, which are usually small in sizes, were widened just enough for someone to crawl in or out while being small enough to still be seen as a normal vent. Secondly, all the internal and external walls were started from the crawl space foundation and elevated up to roof level. This meant the crawl spaces under the ground floor became a blacked-out labyrinth of rooms that only the slave traders understood, the biggest crawl space being the one just below the living room. Just below the corridors of the main house was a resulting crawl space corridor, adding another layer of secrecy to the house. All crawl spaces were interconnected via access holes for ventilation and presumably for use when needed, like for instance if there were more captives than usual or maybe in case of inspection. Third, the rooms of the house were used as accommodation for the slave traders. While the crawl spaces underneath, served as prison cells where captured natives were kept, until they were sold off and shipped to the white man's land. From the outside vents, the slaves were forced to crawl to their cells via the crawl space corridor. The small hatch located in the living room of Wood Home was instead used by slave traders to keep an eye on the captives in the cellar underneath. As expected, because of the change of use of the crawl spaces of Wood Home, the prisoners could not stand in their confinement. They could only seat, crouch or lay down. This is how hundreds of African captives were kept hidden away, and sneaked out to be transported to the Americas, without ever raising any suspicion from neighbors. While staying with Wood, it is believed, Chief Asiakoli connived with several other tribal leaders in other villages to plan raids and take captives as slaves. Once captured, the people were taken to Wood Home, and thrown into the cellar under the house. Slaves were crammed there for several weeks, until the slave ships came back, to take them away to the Americas. Before leaving Africa, all slaves who went through the house of slaves were made to partake in a ritual. They were taken to a well, known as the Well of the Chained. Made to take their last bath in Africa, and run around the well 7 times. This ritual was said to shake off everything African from them, and help them lose connections faster than usual. This house was intended to operate illegally as a slave trading post, and it did just that until 1852 when the Crown Envoy of England visited the king with a message and a cane symbolizing the end of slavery. One interesting aspect of the House of Slaves tour is its interactive nature. Not content to simply tell you about the experience of the captured men and women in Agbodrafo, the tour takes you underneath the wooden house, to feel and experience the conditions in which the slaves lived. There are no ladders or stairs to help you descend to the sandy basement below. Just lower yourself through the opening and the ground will cushion your fall. Once below in the cellar, underneath the House of Slaves, you will crawl on your hands and knees to see where the slaves were shackled and kept in waiting. Up above, the wooden house was a lively trading post and social center. Slaves could hear parties and dances while they suffered directly underneath. Occasionally, a slave was brought up to the house, to act as a servant for the night, providing a respite from the cramped quarters, but also acting as an ominous sign of what their future held. Slaves could wait for weeks for a ship to arrive. The artwork to the right of the entrance to House of Slaves carries the inscription, "Slavery, Never Again." In these times of racial injustice in the world, visiting places like House of Slaves is more important than ever. The history of Wold Slave House was only discovered recently, and since then it has received the support of UNESCO for its renovation. This Afro-Brazilian style building was successfully restored and opened as a tourist site to the public in 2006. But right now, in year 2021, it is clear it is still in dire need of restoration. A call to action is needed, to save the House of Slaves, or else it will probably not survive for future generations to visit. The House of Slaves of Agbodrafo is still one of the most visited historical sites in West Africa. You will not be disappointed when you visit because the site is like an ancient vestige that has just been discovered. The building and its contents are almost entirely intact, and in their original state since 1836. The floor is original, the dining table, chairs, the rooms, wardrobes, safe, even the cellar and its sands are original. You will feel as if you were back in time of slave trade in 1835-36. Only the roof and 1 or 2 floorboards have been replaced due to wear and tear. The house is included in the UNESCO World Heritage Tentative List and is also being considered for inclusion in the World Heritage List of sites with outstanding universal value to the world. Now, let's go on a tour of the House of Slaves and also visit gift shop for all your souvenirs of Agbodrafo.
Thank you for watching. Check our YouTube channel for all current or future videos, all in Togo. And, click the subscribe button and activate the bell to always be the first to be notified of all new videos.